Hey everyone, welcome back for part two, more on board governance, board development, and that board development strategy. Let's jump back in. Can I share an idea, Randall? Ask
Of
your
course.
opinion. I've been on board meetings where, in passing, the executive director or someone will say, "Oh, well, such and such organization or so and so from here, reached out or offered this sort of partnership or collaboration," and they just sort of like mentioned it in passing as if like they don't have it's not their priority, or they're going to give the meeting to it and see what happens. And I'll go, I'm fascinated by, what is your image? What is your brand that these are the people that are reaching out to partner with you? I think that's interesting information to hear, like what opportunities are presenting themselves or what ideas you're passing on, right? Because if the team is moving so quickly, they're passing on things because they have other priorities. For me, it's interesting as the board to go, wait a second, like I have an idea on that, or like I think I can run with that. Like, what do you think?
That's true. And for those listening, you're probably listening through the lens of, gee, we've got a very high functioning strategy policy oriented board, or you're thinking or listening through the lens of, well, you know what, we're a startup, or we're a not-for-profit, a professional association, or whatever it happens to be, a regulatory board. And so where you're coming from will be, because sometimes it's like, hey, listen, the expression is noses in, hands out, right? Hey, the board, this is the job of management, okay? And it might bother you that you know that some of these things might be passed off, but is the board meeting the actual forum to spend time on that kind of thing? If you're trying to move the board to be a more strategic board, then maybe that's the kind of conversation that happens outside the board meeting. Still happens, but outside the board meeting. If you're an early stage operational board, I completely agree. If you're doing operational things as a board, that's actually when you would bring up that point, Rania. So it's a good one. It's a good one.
I'll go here to a next question from Andrew. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the board book agenda development process and how that impacts board development goals. What steps could be taken in the planning phases to nudge the board towards being the highest functioning board it can be?
Oh, that is not a hard question. Okay. But I'm so glad that you're actually asking the question, because if you're asking the question, if you could then answer the question. Sometimes people don't even ask that. So for on the agenda, okay, if you look at the annual sort of storyline of how the board operates throughout all the meetings, are you actually putting aside a particular time to do intensive training, a board development day, for example, or a strategic planning retreat, or something like that? Okay, fine, that we can do. But with respect to the actual agenda, I think that it's worthwhile to say, okay, if we're going to do that, can we actually, I'm talking about the board development day, can we actually come back to some of the stuff we learned together on that to see if we're actually doing that kind of thing? Is there any time on the agenda that we can actually put? Okay, an agenda item is, how is the board actually functioning? And to have the conversation around the board, and to solicit people's opinions. What can we do better? People may have some ideas. Sometimes it's so hard to do this as a chair of the board, because you're also a director, and maybe you've got ideas, and if you say something, is everyone gonna, are you one vote? Or if you're facilitating, it's very hard to actually be part of that conversation, right? But I think that if you put an agenda item, maybe it's not every single meeting, but if you're meeting quarterly, maybe it is every single meeting. Are we doing everything we can as a board? Are we functioning as a high functioning board? Because as a chair, what you can do is you can actually put some very specific items. So it's not just an open conversation, but it's a guided conversation on a particular element of it. Okay. So for example, how you deal with conflict of interest, or dealing with the question of challenges in fiduciary duty when it's a complex issue, given your particular situation. Um, I think it's when it comes to the agenda development process. On one part, there's okay, what does the management actually want to actually have on the agenda? On the other hand, there's, given whatever your strategic plan is, what is the progress towards each of the elements of that particular strategic plan? Are there measures in place if you've got them? Are you using a balanced scorecard if you're in the not-for-profit world? Are there particular strategic initiatives, et cetera, that need to be reported on? And there's a dashboard. If there's some key success factors, or if there's some items that you're doing, maybe those things can be reported on, et cetera. And when there's gaps or when there's new opportunities, some of the board time can be spent on drilling into that, whether it's brainstorming or asking questions or exploring topics like risk, et cetera. But it's really between obviously the uh, what the board is, what the board chair and what the CEO effectively they set the agenda. So for the board chair, part of that job, if you're doing say between board check-ins, to have a conversation with the chairs of your major committees, if you have one, what needs to come up to the next more board meeting on the agenda, to do touch bases with each board member. How's it going? Okay, is there anything we need to put on the agenda? Is there anything from the past agenda items that you think are needed greater exploration on? And finally, sometimes you say, well, we know what we know as a board, but we don't know what we don't know. Maybe we should actually bring somebody else in to do something for part of a board meeting, so that board development, if you will, doesn't just happen once a year or twice a year on these special days you're investing in, but maybe there's something to be done in a small way to nudge it forward. Um, I think, Andrew, when you say nudging the board towards being the highest functioning board it can be, sometimes the issue isn't the board as a whole and the board process, if you will, but it's the particular individual. And I don't want to say there's always a troublemaker. Okay, everyone's individual, and you do want that diversity of views, but sometimes it's a question of saying, okay, as the board chair, how are you actually individually working with those where board members where there's some particular challenges? Somebody's abrasive, somebody's always doing the gotcha questions. Okay, somebody is not participating, for example, in the conversation so much. They're distracted or they're bored. They've been on the board a long particular time. And so making sure that you've got good raw material around the table and making sure that everyone actually is engaged is kind of halfway there. I think also the whole question of what's the board dynamic is one that nudges people towards a higher functioning board. So, if you have a board meeting, let's call it a full day board meeting, right? Are you going out for dinner the night before? Just have some social time, right? If you're doing a half day board meeting, are you bringing in breakfast and just giving people time to talk? Are you going out for lunch as a board to a restaurant to have those conversations informally and just build those relationships, right? And I think that helps grease the wheels when it comes to some of the tougher conversations, and makes people feel a lot more psychologically safe, if you will, to bring up issues. And most people around the board are, certainly, public company boards and most private company boards, they're not shrinking violets. If they've got something to say, they're going to say it, right? But you know what? If there's a higher degree of personal trust around the board, it just makes it easier to have a conversation when somebody does bring something up. There's probably a lot more I could talk about the question on the agenda development process, but why don't we leave it for there? Andrew, has that been helpful?
Yes, very much. Thanks so much, Randall.
Uh, it's just an excellent question. Excellent question. By the way, let me just say that, boy, a lot sort of is sitting on the chair of the board's desk, okay, in terms of all the different things that they can do. Yet, if you think about who's the chair of the board and how they got there, is it, in a private company, is it the biggest shareholder? Okay, is it somebody who's actually got the skill of being a chair? Is it, how did they get, to be a great chair of the board, right? In the not-for-profit world, is it somebody who, had their arm twisted to do that job because nobody wanted to do it, right? And what does that mean in terms of how they're going to do the job, even if they're equipped to do the job? It's a real challenge. It's a real challenge. So, you know, these are things that are under the control of the board to actually do something about, whether it's investment in coaching or training or just attending sessions like the one we're having today, right? So.
When we're talking about board development goals, I mean, I'm very fascinated by that, and I love working with boards for that reason. But if like talk to me about that, Randall, that what that development looks like in the rearview mirror, hindsight being 2020. If you're looking back 1 year, 3 years, 5 years out of what your goals are for your board, like what would that look like? With
Oh, that's
people are stepping on and off the board, like how do you nudge the board? You talked about the individual people that may need, some course correction.
I think it's an interesting thing because the board is a very fluid organization, right? If I take a look at all the boards I've sat on over the last, oh, I don't know, decades and decades, um, you know, and I'm talking about private company boards, I'm talking not-for-profit boards and now public company boards. The needs of the particular organization demand a certain type of board, right? And a certain type of board member, right? And so the people that you have around the table at one stage, maybe 3 years later, 4 years later, the kind of skills that you need are very different. Okay, private company, you've got a CFO. I'm talking about the management side, who's a great CFO, but they've never brought a company public. You probably will need to figure out how to get a different kind of skill set in that CFO role that understands all the regulatory and compliance angle of it, not just the accounting and the financing aspect of it. So that's an example. On the board side, it's the same thing, right? If at the very beginning, well, let's just take a couple examples specifically. Cybercrime, cybersecurity. Okay, at a certain point in an organization's travels, that might not be as much of an issue as when it's bigger and more well known and perhaps a bigger target. An organization that starts out with services then starts to add IP at the very beginning, they don't need to focus so much on IP at the director level, but perhaps after they have a lot of IP, intellectual property, perhaps there should be somebody around the board that has that kind of skill and background and understands a little bit more about it, right? And so if you think about the board evolution, it's not a question of we just want to make sure we've got a good board rotation policy to get the right people on and off, et cetera, so that nobody gets stale. But it's also the needs of the organization evolve over time, and making sure that there's a decent rubric of a skills matrix of what you need and when, and not saying this is a forever thing, but this needs to change from time to time, right? And once again, that's something that the chair has got to be responsible for, and they could knock on outside doors, and we could talk about that kind of thing. But the real thing is to recognize that this is a moving object, and not to think about it as static. And it'll be different if you're going to be the chair of the board. Okay, when you sort of step in that role and when you leave, what do you want to actually have that board look like in terms of how it's functioning and how it's actually driving and supporting the businesses or the organization's growth to whatever that next level is?
I have a question, Randall.
Sure.
Um, when we work with leaders and they start pointing at their direct reports and saying they aren't doing XYZ enough and they're not, up to par, you will, as the most diplomatic person I know, Randall, even you will say, well, is it really your failing? Like, where are you failing them as leader that the expectations aren't there or the training's not there or the relationship's not there? So if the board is really the boss of the CEO, if the CEO is underperforming and the board has identified that, like what role has the board played in that? Like would you point to that as the board hasn't done their job or you see it differently?
I've been in situations where we've hired a CEO. The CEO's done incredible work. I've also been in situations where we hired a CEO, and the CEO is we thought we're doing great work, but at the very end, some of the bets that the CEO made were not the greatest bets, and as a result, there had to be a change, right? And nobody wants to make that change because as a board, when you actually put somebody in place, you really, really do want to spend every effort that you have to support them. But at a certain point, if it becomes very clear that there is not a match between, um, I don't know, that inner fire that a leader has for the organization, for the mission, the board's got to make that change. Now, is the board responsible for that? I think the board has got a very supportive role along the way, and if the board hasn't been providing that support, that's a miss from the board. I think the board needs to step up and look in the mirror and say, could we have done a better job here? Okay, or maybe the board has not been doing a proper job monitoring, right? And as a result of that, what could have been solved much earlier wasn't solved, right? Or maybe the board was mixing in so much that the CEO was hampered and he or she just couldn't actually do their job because they're being micromanaged by the board. And the board should say, well, we've got to learn from this. This is a bit of a failing here, right? But most of the time, CEOs are not cheap, and they're dedicated 7 by 24 to actually, moving the mission forward. So I would say that, yeah, if the CEO is not successful, the board should go through a bit of a reflective process because you want to make sure that you learn for that for the next one. But usually it's the CEO just didn't perform, and then they've got to own that, right? So interesting perspective, interesting and a good one.
There are lots of governance consultants out there. Tell me, like, where do you think a governance consultant, when would you call one? Like, what problem do you think that they could solve and really have a positive impact on the board?
I think the best way to actually have that to decide that is not to sort of wait until there's a problem, okay, but to actually have a conversation, or for that matter, attend sessions like what we're doing right now. If you're having a conversation, most people say, listen, I'll give you an hour of my time. Let's just talk about what's going on there. It's not a sales pitch, okay? It's really more a question of, for me anyway, I could say I love to understand what's happening. I learn an awful lot from these conversations. So I think having that conversation and everything, and a good advisor will actually ask you a bunch of questions that get you thinking, I never thought of that. Gee, I hadn't considered that approach. Gee, and it's you know what you know, you don't know what you don't know. So find a lot of those things, if you will, you can actually deal with yourself as the chair of the board, right? But there's probably a few other things that you might want to actually knock on the door of that same advisor who gave you some of their time and said, I'm just wondering, are you able to help in this area or that area, etc. And at that point, you say, okay, yeah. There's a lot of people who you know, I guess you should also take a look at, what are the qualifications of whoever advises you and what have they done before and what's their background and how many times and do they have letters after the name and so on, right? But I think it all starts with a conversation, not a sales conversation, not a, oh my God, we're in a deep, desperate place. We need to get the lawyers in just to make sure what the rights are, etc. And obligations. But I think sometimes to be a bit proactive is a good thing. Because that way, if you do this, you know that, hey, you got somebody in your back pocket that might be able to help, right? So that's and by the way, a lot of people know each other. If somebody knocked on our door and say, well, listen, we're trying to get some ideas of board compensation, etc. Guess what? We don't do that work, but we know people who do that work. So we would say, hey, listen, why don't you call so and so? They're probably the authorities in the country on that particular topic, right? And so that just builds your support network as the chair, so that when it comes to the time of crisis, you've got people in your back pocket. But hopefully, those conversations will spur some things to prevent you getting into a position of extreme crisis.
Randall, I love that you mentioned compensation. That was my next question. We can swipe to compensation. You and I attended a session for board members talking about how the boards can structure CEO and senior leader compensation to incentivize performance. Okay, so when we talk, let's talk about board compensation. Okay, like, do you have any ideas or reflections or tips or experiences regarding how to incentivize board members for better performance? Because it's much easier to be a board member who does not take risks.
Let's unpack the question a bit. Board compensation, charity boards, no one's getting paid on the board. In fact, you got to write a check to be on the board, most of them anyway. So that's one thing, right? And so the payment, if you will, is spending time with people of a certain caliber and perhaps getting entree, perhaps building up some different skills, etc., or just making sure that your quote investments, if you're a major philanthropist, are being used in a way that are aligned with the mission. So that's charity. It's not for profits like professional associations and everything. Once again, there is no compensation. And in fact, if board members are seen to be getting perks, okay, that often is a problem for the general membership of the professional association. So there's no pay there, but people get paid, if you will, in prestige points. Maybe their name's on the board, on the website as a member of the board, right? Maybe they're involved in some external committees to set the direction and policy and et cetera. So they get some interesting entrees one way or the other. But once again, it's a lot of work there. There's no cash coming back. For startups, okay, they just don't have money. So there will be no checks written because they're constantly doing another raise. And so the question is, how do you get paid? Very often they'll say they'll come up with a per meeting fee and some options, etc. And gee, the per meeting fee we can't pay you, so we'll give you in options or RSUs or DSUs or something, some sort of warrants or something, so that at some point in the future those things might be worth something. For private companies. Some of them will have a special class of share, or they'll give phantom shares of some sort or the other, so that you can participate in the upside one way or the other. But once again, that's sometimes they prefer just to actually write a check, and that's how the compensation gets figured out there. For public companies, it's usually very well documented. There's often a per meeting fee, and sometimes there's an annual fee on top of that. What's fascinating is if you look at the biggest public companies, the banks, there's a huge amount of disclosure with respect to what that compensation is and the form and everything. It's actually a huge amount of money, because being a director at that level is, I don't want to say it's almost a full-time job, but it's a very significant job. Okay, so figuring out what the compensation should be for a director, I'm talking about for private companies and public companies, is a question of really where you are in the life cycle of the business. How much cash you've got versus non-cash, how much room you've got to issue more options if you're a public company, or RSUs, DSUs. And also, frankly, where the people are. Let's just say you've got a board and everybody is a major shareholder. It may very well be that you say, hey, you know what, you're not being paid to actually be on the board, because guess what? If you're doing a good job and you guys are the major shareholders, you're going to get a lot of money as a result of that, because the valuation of the business is going to go up, and that's kind of how you get paid, right? On the other hand, if you've got an independent director or two or three on the board, right, they're not going to have that big upside because they don't have a large ownership stake in the company, and they've got to be compensated another way. So once again, usually there's a per meeting fee. Sometimes there's a little bit more money for the chair. Excuse me. Sometimes if there's an audit committee, if there's an audit, the audit committee chair gets even more, just because that takes a lot more time, and some sort of mechanism to participate in the upside. Which of all the different structures that you want to do, part of it is a question of tax planning. Part of it is the issue of what's the least we can give to make sure that they're highly motivated. Because if it doesn't matter, right? I also say that most directors don't become directors for the purpose of earning the living. They've got something else going on, like their day job or whatever it is. I know a lot of directors who are retired, they've got a bunch of directorships, and that's kind of like the retirement kind of world. But on the other hand, it's not most people have got their day job, so this is not their full-time thing. I could probably talk a lot more about it, but to tell you the truth, it's a question of what's the specific going on with a particular organization. And while we're not, compensation specialists, we've sort of seen enough to sort of say, well, what about this or what about that, etc. So
I want to ask another question, Randall. When it comes to, what's been happening, ongoing on the board, meeting after meeting, year after year, the metrics you have, the scoreboards you have, like what do you see as needing, what should be retired? Like what do we not need anymore? It's too siloed, it's not systems thinking. Like you're good at that. You're good at thinking about the whole ecosystem. Like what has to be updated?
I think I think during COVID X years ago, we had a bit of a shakeup in the sense that all of a sudden boards had to figure out how to be effective remotely, right? And I think that caused people to say, what do we need to leave behind? And we need to relook actually at what we actually need to do our duty. And so what's the next evolution of that? I'm not so sure. I really am not. Because I think every board is kind of at a different place in its own growth, right? And what I would say is the question of are we actually setting the expectations for what our board members and the chair of the board are actually doing? Is the board in charge of the company or is the management in charge of the board? Right? Do we have issues of succession and risk really, really underway? Are we using the brain power around the boardroom table really to brainstorm about the possibilities, the what if, not just the how might we? Excuse me. And are we aware of all these nascent issues? And I don't want to keep on coming back to cybersecurity or IP protection or any of the other disruptive kind of things. But how do we know, for example, what those are without that external input and making sure that we're not sort of just thinking inside the box because we're only looking inside the box? Uh, I think those are the kinds of things that are important. We did have a huge shakeup with respect to COVID. I don't think that everybody is fully recovered in terms of okay, did we lose some things we should have kept? Okay, but I do think that the whole question of doing stuff remotely is something that means that if there has to be a shorter board meeting on something specific, all of a sudden that's a lot easier to do because people are understanding of the technology. Um, I think getting together in person with the board is something that's really, really important. And if there's anything, it's spending more time together because it's not just the official agenda and conversation around the board table, but when you take breaks and you have all these informal, kind of opportunistic conversations, some of the most amazing ideas and understanding and actually happens at that time, not just along the official agenda. So I think maybe that might be something at least.
Thank you for your questions. Any thoughts on today? Any thoughts for your board?
No, thank you very much. And the different perspectives are always super helpful. So appreciate that.
Okay, we could keep going all day, but we're going to pause here. And I'm going to thank everyone who came live, for everyone who's listening in. If anything we talked about resonates with you, if you want to talk more, have a conversation about your board development strategy and board training, board development days, we'd be happy to have a conversation and share resources. Do reach out at request@randallcraig.com or you can book a call at randallcraig.net/30. And we'll look forward to seeing you again at more sessions and see you on LinkedIn.